When you feel like it, you will smuggle in magic. You'll smuggle in magic for miracles in the Bible, you'll smuggle in magic for the origin of life. I can't explain the origin of life at the moment. I mean, nobody can, people are working on it.
But you believe that it will have a naturalistic solution?
Yes, I think that it is a cowardly cop-out to suggest that just because we don't yet understand something, therefore magic did it.
Oh, well, I would agree with that. I mean, the God of the gaps idea.
Well, but that's exactly what you're putting forward, the God of the gaps. You're saying, you're pointing to the origin of life, you're pointing to the origin of DNA and saying, oh, well, okay, Darwin's done everything after the origin of life, but he hasn't done the origin of life.
No,
that's a God.
You're a professor of the public understanding of science, not professor of delivering truth to the public. And these are two different exercises. One of them is you put the truth out there, and like you said, they either buy your book or they don't. Well, that's not being an educator, that's just putting it out there. Being an educator is not only getting the truth right, but there's got to be an act of persuasion in there as well. Persuasion isn't always, here's the facts, you're either an idiot or you're not. It's here are the facts, and here is a sensitivity to your state of mind. And it's the facts plus the sensitivity, when convolved together, creates impact. And I worry that your methods and how articulately barbed you can be ends up simply being ineffective,
yeah,
when you have much more power of influence than what is currently reflected in your output.
I gratefully accept the rebuke. Just one anecdote to show that I'm not the worst in this thing. A former and highly successful editor of New Scientist magazine, who actually built up New Scientist to great new heights, was asked, what is your philosophy at New Scientist? And he said, our philosophy at New Scientist is this: science is interesting, and if you don't agree, you can fuck off.
All right. You've done debates all around the world. Have you ever had a clever or interesting argument from the other side?
No. I do not believe that religion is the root of all evil. Thank you, Channel 4. Religion is the root of quite a lot of evil, but that didn't make for a very catchy title. I just want to briefly reply to Dr. Spivey a couple of points. He says we're fighting a losing battle because religion is a part of our human nature. Well, speak for yourself. It's not a part of mine, and it's not a part of the great majority of my friends in universities in England and the United States and elsewhere. He also said, if we had no religion, how would we do without King's College Chapel, the Sistine Chapel, etc.? Well, you know, artists have to make a living, and in the time when the Sistine Chapel was built and its ceiling was painted, you know who had the money. Artists such as Michelangelo had to go where the patronage was. We shall never know the ceiling that Michelangelo might have painted if he had been commissioned to paint the Museum of Science, for example. We shall never know what Haydn's Evolution oratorio might have sounded like, or Beethoven's Mesozoic Symphony. Now, science doesn't know everything. So it's one of the glories of science that we know what we don't know, and we work on what we don't know, try to shrink what we don't know. It's hard work. We don't cop out by saying, oh, well, if you come to a difficult problem, magic must have done it, or God must have done it. No, we don't say that. We say, right, that's a problem to be solved. It may not be solved this century, it may be solved in the following century, or the one after that. But we don't just lie down and give up and say, oh, well, it must be magic because we don't yet understand it. I would hold up Darwin as a model for the whole of science, because before Darwin came along, the whole of life, the complexity of life, the beauty of life, the elegance of life, the apparent design of life looked like magic. And everybody thought it was magic. Everybody thought that God did it. It's so complicated, it's so elegant. Now, that was the really big problem. That was a far bigger problem than the problem of the origin of life, than the problem of the origin of the cosmos. Darwin solved that problem. All scientists now know that. Darwin solved that problem, and in so doing he provided us with a sort of parable that don't even think about giving up, because if ever there was a time to have given up, it was in the case of biology, because biology really was a difficult problem, a hard problem. Darwin solved it. Now we have one or two other problems remaining, like the origin of life, like the origin of the cosmos, the origin of the laws of physics. No doubt that there are physicists here who can point to yet other ones. Darwin provides us with a lesson that says, don't give up, because if Darwin could solve it for the really difficult problem, which was life, then we have every hope that science will solve it for the other problems in the end. And even if it doesn't, even if science doesn't solve all problems ever, that is still no grounds for saying, oh, well, magic did it. I face two questions. Firstly, is religion true? And second, is it necessary for human psychological welfare or something of that sort? If it isn't true, then for anybody to maintain that somehow humans need it and you're wasting your time trying to get rid of it, what an amazingly patronizing and condescending thing to say. We intellectuals, of course, know that it's not true, but all those poor people out there, they need religion. I mean, what a condescending thing to say about all those people. Either it's true or it's not. And I have enough respect for people to say that if it's not true, people will reconcile themselves to that and will not find any need for it. Now, I was asked a specific question, is it in the genes? Is there some Darwinian reason for religiosity? Maybe there is, but that doesn't bear in the slightest degree on whether it's true. I care about whether it's true. I also care, as a Darwinian, about the origin of it, and I'm interested in the origin of it, and I'm inclined to agree with the implied suggestion of the questioner that it may be that religion itself has no advantage, but it may be that it's a byproduct of some other psychological disposition which does. But that is an entirely separate question from whether it's true, and I don't like it when people say, oh, humans need it, or we have it built into us in our genes, or Darwinian natural selection has built into it, therefore that somehow validates it. Of course it doesn't validate it. It merely says that it's been built into us by natural selection, just as all sorts of other probably disagreeable things have been built into us. Doesn't mean we can't try to cure ourselves.
Right. Okay, can I just...
We are incredibly social animals, as I said before, and when somebody does you a good turn, it's important to be grateful. It's important to pay back the favor and to express your gratitude. And that, I suggest, might generalize the psychological predisposition to feel grateful when something good happens to you. Might generalize from feeling grateful when a person does something good for you and when the weather does, say. When an accident happens, when there's an earthquake and your child doesn't die, you feel grateful. And you feel the need to be grateful to something or somebody. And you can't feel grateful to other people because they're not responsible for the weather. So you conjure up a fictitious person to feel grateful to. And that's a special case, really, of the idea that it's good survival practice to suspect agents in nature. A lot of what happens in nature doesn't have an agent deliberately causing it. A lot of it is the weather, a lot of it is the wind,
A lot of it is just plain accidents that happen. But when there are agents around, and where those agents might be lions or leopards or crocodiles who might be lurking in wait for you, or might be stalking you, then it's important for your survival to attribute agency to things, and that may generalize even to places where there's no agency. And I've often used the example of a rustling in the long grass, which could be the wind, is actually most likely to be the wind, but which could be a lion. And although the odds are that it's the wind, your best bet is probably to assume that it's a lion, because if you get the bet wrong, if you bet on it being the wind and your bet is wrong, that's rather tragic. So there may be a psychological predisposition to invent agencies, invent agents where there aren't any. And this same psychological predisposition generalizes itself to wind gods and thunder gods and lightning gods and river gods and sea gods and things like that, which then become merged later on in cultural evolution into the gods, into the named gods like Thor and Zeus and Apollo and Yahweh.
On the one hand, religious thinkers will say we don't need evidence, we do it by faith. On the other hand, if there's the slightest sniff of a possibility of evidence, then, as you say, they will jump on it. No, I mean, I would say I have a bigger worry with literalism, and that is a big problem. We don't have it so much in this country, but in America it's a very serious problem. And so serious theologians like the Chief Rabbi who don't take it literally are, as it were, less of a problem.
Kinds of abuse.
I want to be very clear that I do think that religious education is important. I don't think that children should be left ignorant of religion. I think they should be taught about religion, about the great world religions. What they should not be taught is you are a Christian, you are a Catholic, you are a Protestant, you are a Jew, therefore you believe X. I think it's right to say there are people called Christians, there are people called Catholics, there are people called Muslims, and these are the things that they believe, and that's very important. I think it's extremely important to be given a sight of the holy books of the world, because they inform world literature. What I do not think is that children, when they're too young to understand, should be told, you are a Catholic child, this is what you believe. That, I think, is wicked.
School. So here in this school are Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Hindus, and so on and so forth.
How old are they?
What? 5 to 11.
You see, when you talk about a 5-year-old child being a Muslim child,
yeah,
that's just not right. What you mean is a child of Muslim parents. That's exactly my point.
Yeah.
You're conceding what the whole of society does concede, which it is correct to label a child with the religion of its parents when the child is too young to have done its thinking for itself. I think it is really unrealistic to suggest that we need religion in order to come to moral decisions, or that actually we, as a matter of fact, do use religion. As I look historically at the way our moral values have changed, they have changed hugely over the centuries, over the decades, within any given century. You can more or less label what decade a piece of ordinary fiction in the 20th century comes from by looking at the moral values which the characters in it, whether they're racist or sexist. You can tell whether it's late 20th century, mid-20th century, or early 20th century, or 21st century. My point is that the moral zeitgeist, which we all of us in a society share, labels us as being, shall we say, early 21st century citizens, much more than it labels us as being religious or non-religious. There's far more in common between a liberal enlightened Jew and a liberal enlightened atheist today, morally speaking, than there is between either of us and somebody of 200 years ago or even 100 years ago. And so the moral zeitgeist advances historically for non-religious reasons, and religious people and non-religious people advance hand in hand from decade to decades. It's not to do with religion, it's to do with advances in moral philosophy, in legal philosophy, in the general discourse of society. That's what's changing, that's what gives us our moral values. For me, one of the most horrible aspects of the Salman Rushdie affair was the way non-Muslim intellectuals in this country and in America took the part of the Ayatollah Khomeini. It was utterly disgraceful to see senior clerics and senior scholars in this country saying, "Oh, Salman Rushdie got what he asked for. He deserved what he got." And politicians. The threats that were made not only against him but against his publisher. There was a terrible story told by the publisher Penguin Books, whose daughter was threatened at her school, and parents were complaining about this girl being at the school because they said, what if the Muslims attack the school and they get the wrong girl? So the publisher of Penguin said, the wrong girl? Who is the right girl in that case? I see enormous social value in the contributions of individual religious people. I do not see social value in religion itself. And I've said before that I take on board the Chief Rabbi's very interesting point that such social value as there may be comes from the sense of community that religion may build up, as opposed to the actual religious beliefs, which I do not think have any social value at all. If you want to get that sort of value system from religion, I want you to ask yourself, whereabouts in religion do you get it? Which religion do you get it from? They're all different. If you get it from the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, then I beg you, don't get it from your holy book, because it's, to repeat that opening line of chapter 2 of my book, the morality you will get from your holy book is hideous. Don't get it from your holy book. Don't get it from sucking up to your God. Don't get it from saying, oh, I'm terrified of going to hell, so I'd better be good. That's a very ignoble reason to be good. Instead, be good for good reasons. Be good for the reason that you've decided together with other people the society we want to live in, a decent, humane society, not one based on absolutism, not one based on holy books, and not one based on sucking up to looking over your shoulder to the divine spy camera in the sky.
Is a scientist who believes that Jesus turned water into wine. A scientist who believes that Jesus somehow influenced all those molecules of H2O and introduced proteins and carbohydrates and tannins and alcohol and turned it into wine. He believes that Jesus walked on water. I had been accustomed to debating with sophisticated theologians, and I come across John Lennox, who is a scientist who believes in all those things. In particular, he believes that the creator of the universe, the God who devised the laws of physics, the laws of mathematics, the physical constants, who devised the parsecs of space, billions of light years of space, billions of years of time, that this paragon of physical science, this genius of mathematics, couldn't think of a better way to rid the world of sin than to come to this little speck of cosmic dust and have himself tortured and executed so that he could forgive himself. That is profoundly unscientific. Not only is it unscientific, it doesn't do justice to the grandeur of the universe. It's petty and small-minded, and that's the God that John Lennox believes in. Now, in the case of the cosmos, freak accident or design, the point that I've made over and over again is that even if we don't understand how it came about, it's not helpful to postulate a creator, because the creator is the very kind of thing that needs an explanation. And although it's difficult enough to explain how a very simple origin of the universe came into being, how matter and energy, how one or two physical constants came into existence, although it's difficult enough to think how simplicity came into existence, it's a hell of a lot harder to think how something as complicated as a God comes into existence, difficult enough to think of how a deist God comes into existence, and even more difficult to think of how a Christian God who actually cares about things like sin and gets himself born of a virgin.
Then there's no ultimate justice. And one of the things that the resurrection transforms for me from pettiness right into center stage is, if this is true, then there's real hope that there be a rational evaluation and fair justice at the end of the world. But atheism doesn't give you that.
Okay, suppose there is no hope, suppose there is no justice, suppose there's nothing but misery and darkness and bleakness, suppose there is nothing that we would wish for, nothing that we would hope for. Too bad. That doesn't make it true, just because God would make us feel good. You could possibly persuade me that there was some kind of creative force in the universe. There was some kind of physical, mathematical genius who created everything. The expanding universe, devised quantum theory, relativity, and all that. You could possibly persuade me of that. But that is radically and fundamentally incompatible with the sort of God who cares about sin, the sort of God who cares about what you do with your genitals, the sort of God who is interested, who has the slightest interest in your private thoughts and wickednesses and things like that. Surely you can see that a God who's grand enough to make the universe is not going to give a tuppenny cuss about what you're thinking about and your sins and things like that. I think there's something wonderful about standing up and facing up to a universe where we are increasing our understanding, and we throw away childhood obsessions, we throw away the sort of imaginary friend that comforts us when we're children, and we feel the need for some kind of parent figure to turn to. I think when we grow up, we need to cast that aside and stand up tall in the universe. And it's cold, and we're not going to last for it. We're going to die, and we face up to that. And I think that's a nobler way of getting through life than to pin your hopes on childhood illusions. I think that it is a tragedy that people waste their lives devoting it to such fanciful, imaginary purposes, but I can't deny that they do. It has been suggested that the laws of physics are extremely fine-tuned, and that if they were any different, the universe as we know it wouldn't exist, stars wouldn't exist, chemistry wouldn't exist, biology wouldn't exist, and we wouldn't exist. And theists are tempted to say, therefore the laws of physics must have been designed in such a way that they are exactly fine-tuned to bring us into existence. Once again, that is a non-explanation, because it leaves open the explanation for the designer. There are many physicists who explain that by saying, well, with the so-called anthropic principle, saying that we could only exist in a universe which has the right laws and the right constants to bring us into existence, and therefore the fact that we're talking about it determines that we must be in such a universe. That's the anthropic principle. There are versions of it which make it a bit more plausible. For example, the multiverse theory, that there are lots of different universes, that we live in a kind of bubbling foam of universes, and each bubble in the foam has a different set of laws of physics. The vast majority of those laws of physics are not conducive to giving rise to us. A tiny minority are conducive to giving rise to advanced life forms. And once again, the anthropic principle comes in. We could only exist, we could only be in one of those bubbles that has the necessary laws of physics to bring us into existence. And therefore, obviously, since we do exist, since we're talking about it, we must be in such a universe. Now, science doesn't know everything. So it's one of the glories of science that we know what we don't know, and we work on what we don't know, try to shrink what we don't know. It's hard work. We don't cop out by saying, oh, well, if you come to a difficult problem, magic must have done it, or God must have done it. No, we don't say that. We say, right, that's a problem to be solved. It may not be solved this century, it may be solved in the following century, or the one after that. But we don't just lie down and give up and say, oh, well, it must be magic because we don't yet understand it.
Are you an atheist?
For all practical purposes, yes. Nobody can actually say for certain that anything doesn't exist. But I'm an atheist in the same way as I'm an a-leprechaunist and an a-fairyist and an a-pink unicornist.
So you're not 100% sure God doesn't exist, but you're sure enough to make it practically...
I'm as sure as you are sure that fairies and leprechauns don't exist.
And do you see an equivalence between the idea of God and the idea of a fairy and a leprechaun?
The evidence for both is equally poor. There is a logical progression that goes from believing in faith, having faith that your God tells you to do something, and doing terrible deeds, like suicide bombing, like flying planes into skyscrapers. The vast majority of people of faith don't do such terrible things. But those people who do terrible things do it believing that they are righteous and good, and they think that they're doing the will of their God. So they're not evil people, they're actually good people by their own lights. They believe they're doing good things, and that's why religion is evil, because it can make you do evil things believing that they are good.
Do you really believe that people who go out and carry out suicide bombings, it is faith? Religion is to blame, not geopolitics, not the world, not their lives, not what's going on around us. It's religion, plain and simple.
Not always. It's not in the case of the Tamil Tigers, for example. But I think in a great majority of cases it is, and I think it certainly makes it a hell of a lot easier. The evidence is plain that in many Islamic suicide bombers, you talk to them, those who fail, you talk to them afterwards, they've got paradise on the brain. They're desperate to go to a martyr's heaven, and that's what they think about.
But then what about the majority of the world's Muslim clerics and ulama who came out and condemned 9/11 straight
Well, I'm
afterwards?
delighted they did, but they were pretty quiet about it.
What about the argument that says human beings are prone to violence, they're prone to carrying out crimes against their fellow man? You can blame religion, you can blame politics, you can blame economics, lots of factors, lots of excuses. What I don't get is, why do you only focus on religion? For fairness, why don't you also isolate the other factors?
There are lots of other factors, and I'm quite happy to say that, yes. There are lots of, I mean, if you look at the wars of history, some of them have been about religion, plenty of them have not been about religion. I never said religion is the sole cause of wars and violence. Dogmatic belief in something like religion, or something like Marxism, or something like Nazism, these are all, or indeed patriotism, I mean, my country right or wrong, these are all pernicious beliefs which can drive people to do terrible things. And in the Second World War, Hitlerism was driven by racism, by a sort of sub-Wagnerian pagan religion which Hitler revived. Stalin's atrocities were motivated by a dogmatic belief in Marxism.
And atheism.
Stalin happened to be an atheist, but he was never motivated specifically.
The Soviet Union was not based on scientific rationalism, on the elimination of religion and God?
Stalin persecuted the church. Stalin persecuted just about everybody.
Are you saying that the Soviet Union, the leaders of the Soviet Union, were not driven by a hatred of religion and a belief that science and human progress and materialism was the way forward?
They believed that materialism, science, human progress, those are kind of there was a Marxist slant on those words.
Let me put a statement in context to you. Albania, one of the world's worst dictatorships, tyrannies that we've seen in the last 100 years. Article 37 of Albania's communist constitution declared, quote, "The state recognizes no religion and supports atheistic propaganda in order to implant a scientific, materialistic world outlook in people."
What do you think you're saying? I mean, that's an appalling thing to say. Of course it is.
Why is that an appalling thing to say? What do you disagree with in that statement?
Why would I want to support atheistic propaganda? I support science and truth.
But you don't support spreading atheism.
I support spreading science and truth. If that happens to be atheism, I support it. I'm not going to start bullying people into being atheist. I'm not going to start trying to compel people to be atheists. That was what the Albanians were doing. It's nothing to do with what I want to do.
Of course, but you'd like to persuade them not to be believers and become atheists.
I'd like to raise consciousness in a gentle, civilized way, using argument, rational argument, from evidence. I care about what's true. I mean, do you actually believe in your Muslim faith? Do you believe that Muhammad
split the moon in two? Do you believe that Muhammad flew to heaven on a winged horse, for example? I pay you the compliment of assuming that you don't.
No, I do. I believe in miracles.
You believe that?
Yes.
You believe that Muhammad went to heaven on a winged horse?
Yes, I believe in God. I believe in miracles. I believe in revelation. I mean, the point here is that let's assume I'm wrong, Richard. I'm wrong. Let's concede that God does not exist. Let's concede that religion is false. My problem here is trying to understand why some of the new atheists are so anti-religion when religious people clearly are doing lots of good things and they're doing it in the name of God.
I've never denied that religious people are doing good things and non-religious people are doing good things. I care about what's true. I'm an educator, I'm a scientist, and I want people to understand the truth about the universe in which they live. That's what I care about. And I regard religion as a distraction, and in some cases a pernicious distraction from true education.
Let me ask you this. Are all people who hold beliefs in God and in miracles and the supernatural, do you regard them all as intellectually inferior to you?
I regard those beliefs as intellectual nonsense. I don't regard the individuals as intellectually inferior to me because many of them palpably are not.
You talk about a story when you tell a story about being in Ireland and talking about the Catholic child abuse scandal. And there's one quote on page 356, which I will read out to you. Horrible as sexual abuse no doubt was, the damage was arguably less than the long-term psychological damage inflicted by bringing the child up Catholic in the first place. You believe that being brought up as a Catholic is worse than being abused by a priest?
There are shades of being abused by a priest, and I quoted the example of a woman in America who wrote to me saying that when she was 7 years old, she was sexually abused by a priest in his car, and at the same time, a friend of hers, who also 7, who was Protestant, or was of Protestant family, I should say, died. And she was told that because her friend was Protestant, she had gone to hell and would be roasting in hell forever. And she told me that of those 2 abuses, she got over the physical abuse. It was yucky, but she got over it. But the mental abuse of being told about hell, she took years to get over. 40%, 45% of the American people believe literally in Adam and Eve, believe literally that the world is only 6,000 years old. I mean, that's a shocking figure, and you can't duck out of it by saying, oh, sophisticated theologians don't believe it. Unfortunately, what sophisticated theologians believe isn't really relevant to what the majority of Christians do believe.
Chris, I think, Richard, cue Chris from the Evangelical Alliance, if I may, because you believe it's all true, don't you?
I do, yeah.
So you believe that you know, Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark, you believe, to just take something, Genesis 19:5, 2 angels came to Lot's house in Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, he was the only righteous man in the village, and the locals wanted to know the angels. They wanted to homosexually rape the angels. So Lot offered his virgin daughters instead as an appeasement. Sodom and Gomorrah was demolished after that, and his wife turned into a block of salt when she looked back. You believe that happened?
I take my cues from Jesus, who we've already agreed is historically
Did that happen?
I believe that Jesus believed the Old Testament to be historically accurate.
Do you believe that that happened?
I believe it happened because Jesus did.
So what lesson are we supposed to get from that story? What moral lesson?
Well,
there's somebody
we're going to
missing
come
in
on
this
to the moral
story.
lessons in a minute.
Yeah.
It is a fact,
There's somebody
but
missing.
touch on it now, Richard. What's
Well,
your
we were
question?
just told that what you get from the Bible is moral lessons, and presumably you say this didn't literally happen, but it's telling us something. What is it telling us?
Well, the moral lesson
let's listen to the voice
moral
that's
lesson
missing in this story, which is Abraham.
Yeah.
Abraham turned to God and argued with God. So the message that I get from this story is argue about it, debate about it, don't accept it as true completely.
Well, why in that case? Why didn't? If you want to convey a message, which is in this case argue about it, why not just say argue about it? Why wrap it up?
Do you want to remember that message?
Bishop Michael, is this not, if I may ask
you
you a
don't
question?
even know what the message is. That's how obscure it is.
The moral message from the Bible. And of course, Richard, in your books, you've been pretty scathing about the God of the Old Testament. Let me just quote you, if I may. The most unpleasant character in all fiction. Misogynistic, homophobic, racist, genocidal, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic. And you go on. It's quite a list that you...
I should have thought that was beyond dispute, but I would come on to the New Testament. What about the God of the New Testament? Here we have a God who wanted to forgive mankind its sins, including, by the way, the sin of Adam, who he presumably knew perfectly well never existed. Nevertheless, he wanted to forgive mankind's sins. Why didn't he just forgive them? Why was it necessary to have a human sacrifice, to have his son tortured and executed in order that the sins of mankind should be absolved? Is that not the most disgusting idea you ever heard? Why didn't he just forgive the sins? Why did he have to sacrifice a scapegoat?
I think
the most disgusting thing you've ever heard.
Professor Dawkins has a view of cheap grace. A real forgiveness comes from restitution, from cost, from sacrifice. It is not God sacrificing his son. It is his son who, in obedience to the divine will, living the divine will in a society that has gone wrong, that is corporately wrong, which is what original sin means, by the way.
So there can be no forgiveness without...
Let me just finish. It is his obedience in the context of a corrupt society that leads to his death. That is his sacrifice, and it is that which restores what was broken between God and human beings.
So there can be no forgiveness without a death, is that
No,
right?
it's not. I'm not saying that. There can be no forgiveness without cost.
How can you applaud that? How can you applaud that?
Because it's true.
Well, not everyone applauded. Some people did, but some people applauded you.
Because there's multiplicity of voices, and that's fine.
Richard, just to come back to you, what about the extraordinary things that Jesus said, that the Bishop Stephen was talking about earlier on? For example, love those who persecute.
Oh, that's wonderful, of course. I mean, whoever said them, whether it was Jesus or not, whether there was...
But why should it not be Jesus?
Well, I don't care if it was Jesus.
Yeah,
it's a wonderful thing to have said.
I mean, why...
Jesus might have said, let him finish the sentence.
Jesus... whoever said it...
Why should he not?
Whoever said it, it was a wonderful thing to say, and of course you can cherry-pick any document and find lovely things to say. But how do you decide what to cherry-pick? You decide what to cherry-pick on the basis of what you have decided is a good thing on other criteria. So we reject the horrific story of Lot and the angels and all the other horrific stories in the Old Testament and the mega horrific story, as I've just said, of the New Testament. And you pick on nice stories like the Sermon on the Mount. But the criterion by which you do your cherry-picking is, of course, something that we all share, which is we are decent human beings. That's where we get it from.
But I suppose
we reject those other aspects of the Bible, which are frankly horrible.
But in the same way, if you listen to the songs that you listen to on the radio are those that speak to you and speak to your heart. And in the same way, that's why you pick them, because they make sense and they speak to your heart and they move you. And that's why you cherry-pick those particular ones.
Of course.
Also, I don't want a hygienic life.
Yeah.
I don't want a life full of things that are just nice and just clean. There's lots that's messy and lots that's difficult that is in the canon and was kept in the canon. Yeah. And also the canon developed. So from a Jewish point of view, we continually developed how we see the Bible, so we continue to develop how we see God and how we see ourselves. So actually, I think there is truth in the messy, horrible stories as well.
That's right. Why? I don't think... You can find good quotations in the Bible to support the point of view that you want to adopt, and of course you can find the exact opposite. So why not bypass the Bible altogether as a source of authority? And simply say, as Shakespeare said, as Milton said, as anybody you like, you quote anybody in literature you like, and as Isaiah said, or as Jesus said, you can get quotations from literature all over the place to bolster the point of view that you want to make. That's what Martin Luther King did, and many other people have done from the Bible. You can get it from Shakespeare, you can get it from Milton, as I say, you can get it from Aldous Huxley,
Dickens.
All sorts of people, Dickens. The Bible should not be given the privileged status. We shouldn't be discussing here, is the Bible relevant today? We should be discussing, is literature generally relevant? Absolutely. Well, of course you can find verses in the Bible that sanction slavery. as well. You can, once again, you can cherry pick, and why bother with the Bible at all when you can go straight to moral philosophy?
Absolutely.
I'm extremely scared of fundamentalism. The same fundamentalism that wants to convert people forcibly is the same voice as you have that says, why bother with this? What I'm concerned about is that you can't hear the different voices.
Are you serious?
Yes.
Look, fundamentalism means tying your colours to a particular book. And it's exactly
and rejecting everything else.
Exactly what I am doing is saying, do not tie yourself to a book. Look at the good ideas, reject the bad ideas, accept the good ideas, find good ideas wherever you may find them. That's the very opposite of fundamentalism.
Yes,
fundamentalism is saying, we have here a book, we have to follow what's in that book.
Okay, so I wouldn't. That's not my approach
That's
to
not
Bible.
your approach,
Certainly not. And nor the approach of most progressive people in this country.
Precisely.
But as a key source text on which we grow and which we develop. And Judaism has taken the Bible and added and expanded and expanded and expanded, so that our rabbinic literature is vast, starting with the Bible. But we don't live in the desert anymore. We're not tribes in the desert, and there, thank God, no high priests. And so I live a very different Judaism than the biblical one.
Of course, I'm delighted by all that, and that's exactly what I'm advocating, that we should not live by a book.
So,
and I know you don't live by the book, but unfortunately, the vast majority of religious people in the world do.
But I don't turn around and say, and therefore chuck it all out. The language that you use...
Did I say chuck it all out?
You said, why deal with the Bible at all?
I said, why deal with the Bible as a moral text? I value the Bible hugely as a work of literature, as I've said in my book, The God Delusion, at some length. So, yes.
Where would we be as a society without the Ten Commandments?
Well, let me
Where
take
would
up
we
the
be
position of
without
the
our Lord's summary of the law?
Let's take up the Ten Commandments.
Let me finish. Where would we be without our Lord's summary about loving God and loving neighbour? These things are foundational to our moral thinking.
Richard, where would we be without the Ten Commandments is the question.
Commandment number 1, thou shalt have no other God before me. Commandment number 2, thou shalt make no graven image. Commandment number 3, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord in vain. Commandment number 4, thou shalt observe the Sabbath. What's that got to do with anything?
Everything. It means humility. It means, I want to say, that it means humility. The first commandment, there is a God. The second commandment, don't have other gods. What does it mean? I'm God, you're not. Therefore, it's about suppressing our ego and knowing that I, as a human, am not the centre of everything.
Precisely.
We actually put new books in and take some of the others out.
We actually need to understand it and understand the fundamental thinking and philosophy behind it in fresh ways, in the light of history, yes, in the light of modern theological criticism, yes, and we need to use revelation, which I believe didn't stop 2,000 years ago, but continues in the context of the society in which we live today. That means the end of slavery, the bad treatment of women, and some of the other stuff that, frankly, is rubbish in the Bible.
But how do you decide?
Frankly, it's rubbish in the Bible.
There is some rubbish in the Bible.
I'm looking at that purple shirt of yours and hearing what you're saying.
No problem. I am not a Christian who finds simply my faith based on a book written 2,000 plus years ago. It's actually part of revelation and part of my faith in Jesus Christ.
So we all want to do good, and we can discuss together how to do good. Why would we bother to go back to a book that was written 2,600 years ago in order to do that? When you think who wrote that book, they were ignorant, they were desert-dwelling scribes. They had absolutely no...
This is the arrogance of the modern world. This is arrogance, that these people, these geniuses who put the Bible together...
Genius.
Genius. Even at the level of literature, I mean, why do you admire it as literature if they were not geniuses?
Well, I admire the English literature of the... I've no idea about the original Hebrew. I know.
To look at the Bible and have no idea about the original Hebrew and then to say they were ignorant is frightening.
Francesca.
I've got to answer that.
Wait a minute.
I've got to answer that. Of course, the Bible was written in Hebrew. I was about to say when I was cut off, that I have no way of judging the literary quality of the original Hebrew. I'm
I can read Hebrew, and I say it's
very
pretty good.
I'm told that the original Hebrew is a very good quality. Nevertheless, when we're talking about moral philosophy, when we're talking about the origin of the cosmos, when we're talking about the origin of life, when we're talking about why we all exist, there is no reason whatever why we should treat the writings of scribes in whatever it was, 800 BC, 600 BC, as being particularly wise. We could listen to Confucius, we could listen to the Buddha, there are all sorts of people we could listen to, and we could listen to modern philosophers as well and modern scientists as well. Once again, I come back to the point, there is nothing special about the Bible. If the Bible has any chance of lasting, it had better stick with the King James Version, because once it gets turned into modern English, everybody can read it and see what nonsense it is, whereas if you read it in the...
We've only got 1 minute. Laura.
I would say the Bible plus interpretations.
Okay.
The Bible as a source.
Francesca.
I think we cannot possibly understand Western culture and the history of Western culture without the Bible, and so for that reason...
Your equivalent in 2,000 years will still be in business.
I think so. I'll still be in a job, or people like me will still be in a job, yeah.
Well, that's good news.
That's true.
Thank you all very much indeed for taking part. Thank you all very much. All the debates continue on our message board. Next week we're in Birmingham. We hope to see you there. Goodbye from everyone here in Bury. Have a good Sunday.
Now, you raise the question, doesn't it all have to be working before it's any good? How could we bump along for millions of years with only half an eye? That's a bit of a fallacy, because actually only a quarter of an eye, only a hundredth of an eye is better than nothing. You can make a slowly climbing ramp of improvement from just the very rudiments of vision, just say being able to tell the difference between light and shade, nothing more than that, right up to the perfection of a human eye or the eye of a hawk, say. And in order for evolution to explain that, all we need is that there should be a ramp of improvement where every step, a hundredth of an eye, 200ths of an eye, 300ths of an eye, etc., 50% of an eye, 51% of an eye, each step has got to be an improvement on the one that went before. And it's easy to see why that would be. You start by being able to tell whether there's a shadow, whether it's night or day. Shadow's useful, that could be a predator moving overhead in the sea. Night or day is obviously useful for all sorts of purposes. Then you could imagine a cup. Instead of just having a flat sheet of light-sensitive cells, the edges turn up into a cup. Now, the cup means that if there's light coming from that direction, it hits that part of the eye. If there's light coming from that direction, it hits that part of the eye. So already the animal can tell the direction from which light is coming and the direction from which a shadow is coming. So we haven't got an image yet. All we've got is the direction of light. Now the cup can steadily and slowly over evolutionary time close over until you end up with a little hole at the top. And the little hole at the top, the same principles working all the way, that light coming from that direction hits that part of the retina, and from that direction hits this part of the retina, but because there's a hole, it's rather more precisely, not exactly focused, but light from there hits there, light from there hits there, light from there hits there, because it's got to get through the hole. We're moving towards a pinhole camera. Now, a pinhole camera, if you make the hole small enough, and remember we're having a smooth gradient of closing up the hole, if you make the hole small enough, then it makes a sharp, focused image. The trouble with a pinhole camera is that the image is very dim because very little light can get through the pinhole. What you need is a lens, because what a lens does is gather light from different directions and focus it on a point. Instead of it having to go right through the middle of the hole, it can be gathered from a wider range of sources. Now, a lens is not difficult to arrange. Any old chunk of transparent gubbins will do the job better than a pinhole. So once again, we've got a slow, gradual improvement. Any old
lump of gubbins, transparent, is better than nothing, and then the lens simply improves its shape gradually. It's got to be gradually. Every step has got to be a slight improvement over the previous one. You get a lens. Is that if you look around the animal kingdom today, and you mentioned trilobites, but there are lots and lots of animals which show eyes in all sorts of what we might think of as states of sort of half development. I mean, there are flatworms that have just a cup for an eye, no lens, not even a pinhole. There are animals like Nautilus, which is a sort of coiled up squid kind of thing in a shell, which has a pinhole camera for an eye. So each step of the way that I told you about might have been hypothetical, but you can find an animal somewhere around the animal kingdom, a living animal, which actually does it. So I don't understand why you don't find that convincing. The retina is back to front, and the retina of the vertebrate eye is back to front in the sense that the light-sensitive cells are pointing away from the light. Now, the light-sensitive cells are connected to the brain via nerves, and any sensible designer would have had the nerves behind the light-sensitive cells, which is in fact the way they are in mollusks, for example, octopuses, which have rather good eyes, rather like ours, with the difference being that the light-sensitive cells point towards the light, and the wires connecting it to the brain lead backwards to the brain, which is the sensible way to do it. Now, the vertebrate eye is back to front, so that the wires that connect the light-sensitive cells to the brain are running along the front of the retina. That means that the light has to penetrate this forest of wires, nerves, before it hits the light-sensitive cells which are facing backwards. Now, it's very easy to see why this happened. It happened for historical reasons, and there's no doubt about that. Now, it is, of course, true that humans, for example, and I mentioned hawks before, see much better than octopuses. So in spite of the fact that our eye has this design flaw, we have better eyes because natural selection comes along afterwards and cleans up after the original mess that was made by this fundamental design flaw. Natural selection came along afterwards and made all sorts of little titivations which have the effect of giving us really rather good vision. And that happens again and again. It's very interesting that you get a bungle to begin with, and then rather than correct the bungle, what natural selection does is to come along and make little titivations, little tinkerings, which sort of make up for the mistake. And that's a very interesting phenomenon.
As Bernie started to pray for me, this incredible, I can describe it as an electrical force, went into the small of my back, and it went through my torso, and it was like thousands of volts. My body started to burn inside, and it felt like burning, and my joints and everything were like it was in my death throes, like I'd been hit by a bus or something, and all of my joints and everything were quivering. And the next day, Richard, I'm praying with somebody who was in the classroom with me. There was a need for prayer, and we held hands, and this electrical power came back out from my torso in reverse and went down my hands and into this person. Now, I didn't say anything. I thought, oh my goodness, what is happening? And this person went like that, and she said, what was that? And I said, what was what? You know, I wasn't going to have any nonsense, okay? And she said, I felt some electrical power come out of you. And I said, what on earth is going on? This, again, this electrical power comes out of my body. How do you describe that? Am I deluded?
Probably, yes. I mean, scientists are not impressed by anecdotes. If you could get a scientist to measure I don't know, your galvanic skin response, you might get some sort of scientific interest in that. But it really, I mean, there are thousands of stories all over the world. People have ghost stories, people have stories of demonic possession, all different religions. They're just not impressive, I'm afraid, to a scientist. And in particular, what I'd like to concentrate on is why, even if these experiences happen to you, why on earth would that make you believe in the book of Genesis, given that all the scientific evidence is against it, given that the Archbishop of Canterbury is against it, given that the Pope is against it, given that any respectable bishop is against it? Why would you go from having electrical tingling down your back to saying that the book of Genesis has got to be true? Why tie it to the book of Genesis?
All right. And there are many other the whole foundation, if you like, of the basis for our faith is the accounts of Abraham are in there.
And Abraham?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Abraham, the one who nearly killed his son. Not a very edifying moral story, is it?
It prefigures really what the Lord did, offered his son.
It does, doesn't it?
It does.
Yes. They're both as ugly as each other, both the stories. Evolution is a process that takes a very long time for interesting things to happen anyway. It takes millions of years for really major evolutionary change to happen. You can see it happening. I mean, we do see it happening in a small way, but of necessity, what you can see during a human lifetime is relatively short, relatively little. And in my book, The Greatest Show on Earth, I've given some examples of that. But the burden of the question is, if you can't see it happening before your very eyes, doesn't that mean that you have to have faith in order to believe it? The answer is no, of course it doesn't, because what you see is the traces, the remains. You see the consequences of the evolutionary process, even though you can't actually watch it happening before your very eyes. It's a bit like, I've likened it to the process whereby a detective comes on the scene of a crime after the crime has been committed. Now, the detective can't actually see the crime being committed, but what he sees is fingerprints, footprints, bloodstains, scuffs on the carpet, all these sorts of evidence which add up to an understanding of how the crime was committed. So fossils are of that type. DNA is of that type. If you look at the DNA in different animals, compare, we've got it up here, beautiful picture you've got for the backdrop. If you look at the DNA of different animals, for a start, all animals and plants have the same DNA code, which is a remarkable fact in itself. And then there are minor differences in the actual sequences, the actual letters that are spelled out by the code. And if you look at those differences, you find that they form a perfect hierarchical pattern. It's a family tree. Now, this is massive, massive, massive quantities of evidence left lying around the Earth. In every species of creature that's ever been looked at is carrying around massive quantities of evidence in the DNA. Then there's fossils in the rocks, massive quantities of evidence, lots of other evidence. Seriously, there isn't a controversy. There may be a controversy within evolution about certain details, but the fact of evolution is uncontroversial. I mean, whether you like it or not, we're cousins of chimpanzees, we're slightly more distant cousins of monkeys, etc. I mean, pig's teeth are really irrelevant. Of course you can dig up mistakes and even outright fraud. I mean, the Piltdown hoax was an outright fraud. But
yes,
that was never used as evidence for evolution. It was just a particular case of somebody in the 1920s who fraudulently made up a fossil.
Yeah.
If you look at the DNA of all animals and all plants, what you find is a beautifully arranged hierarchy. You find that our DNA is close to chimpanzees, slightly more distant from monkeys, slightly more distant still from rats, slightly more distant still from lizards. The whole thing falls into a beautiful hierarchical pattern, just like a family tree. It is a family tree. I don't have them here, obviously, but you can go to any museum and you can see Australopithecus, you can see Homo habilis, you can see Homo erectus, you can see archaic Homo sapiens and modern Homo sapiens. A beautiful series of intermediates. Why do you keep saying, present me with the evidence, when I've done so? Go to the museum and look.
I have gone to the museums, and so have so many of us who still are not convinced
Have you
with
seen
evolution.
Have you seen Homo erectus?
And I think that this effort, this rather aggressive effort to try and talk over us and to censor us, seems to come out of a frustration that so many people still don't believe in evolution. Now, if evolutionists were so confident in their beliefs, there wouldn't be the effort to censor out information that shows that evolution is still lacking and is questionable.
I confess to being frustrated. It's not about suppression, it's about the fact that I have told you about 4 or 5 fossils and you seem to simply be ignoring what I'm saying. Why don't you go and look at those fossils?
And certainly, if they were in the museums, which I've been to many times, then I would look at them objectively. But what I go back to is...
in a museum. I mean, of course, scientists teach controversies all the time. There's a lot of controversy in science. There's evidence on one side, there's evidence on the other side. In this case, however, we have a very large amount of evidence in favor of evolution, but the evidence on the other side is not evidence in favor of anything else. It's actually looking for little gaps. It's looking for little things that allegedly evolution can't explain. Say, look, we found something they can't explain. That must mean God did it. It's not. That's not really. Doesn't sound like science, does it? That sounds like looking for gaps. Current American invasion of Iraq is widely condemned for its civilian casualties, but those casualty figures are orders of magnitude lower than comparable figures for the Second World War. There's a steadily shifting standard of what's morally acceptable. Donald Rumsfeld today may sound callous and odious, but in the time of the Second World War, he would have sounded like a bleeding heart liberal compared to Bomber Harris, the British air marshal responsible for the flattening of Dresden, for example. Something has shifted in the intervening decades, and it's shifted in all of us. The shift has no connection with religion. If anything, it happens in spite of religion, not because of it. There are many people who don't actually believe in religion, but who believe in belief in religion in the sense that they get a nice, warm, fuzzy, glowy feeling when they come across religion. They think it's a good idea for other people to be religious, although, of course, we're much too intelligent to be religious ourselves. But nevertheless, it's a good idea that there is religion around. And I wondered whether Stephen Weinberg, who's a man I enormously respect and who is one of the staunchest atheists on the planet, was feeling the need to bend over backwards and be just a little bit nice about religion, scrape the barrel to find something nice to say about religion. And so we came up with this picture of the elderly aunt who we'll all miss her when she goes. I won't miss her at all. Not one scrap, not one smidgen. I am utterly fed up with the respect that we, all of us, including the secular among us, have been brainwashed into bestowing upon religion. What would we miss? Would we miss the music? Would we miss the poetry? Well, yes, we would. We would miss the music. The B minor Mass, the Matthew Passion, these happen to be on a religious theme, but they might as well not be. They're beautiful music on a great poetic theme, but we could still go on enjoying them without believing in any of that supernatural rubbish. When we've lost religion, as I hope one day we shall have lost the appalling guilt that afflicts people brainwashed as children into being religious. We shall have lost the brainwashing of children, which indeed labels them as belonging, as sharing the same religious opinions as their parents, a form of child abuse. We shall have lost the subversion of science, which comes from teaching children that faith is a virtue, faith meaning belief without evidence. Children are systematically taught that there is a higher kind of knowledge which comes from faith, which comes from revelation, which comes from scripture, which comes from tradition, and it's the equal, if not the superior, of knowledge that comes from real evidence. Trying to woo people of religion over to evolution by seeking out passages in the Bible which have some faint, vague, tenuous connection to evolution, the kine that were speckled and brown, the mustard seed, or not the Bible, but in the Christian communion service, the wafer as being in some poetic sense symbolic of St. Paul's view that we are all of one body. Why bother to express truths, if they are truths? Why bother to make up a parable, to make up this tenuous allegory, when you can just tell people the truth? The truth is perfectly simple. Why bother with going back to the Bible and seeking out some sort of analogy. Why not just teach natural selection, teach evolution the way it is? It's perfectly simple. You don't need to this strained, unnatural seizing of a possible analogy from the Bible. Just one anecdote to show that I'm not the worst in this thing. A former and highly successful editor of New Scientist magazine, who actually built up New Scientist to great new heights, was asked, "What is your philosophy at New Scientist?" And he said, "Our philosophy at New Scientist is this: science is interesting, and if you don't agree, you can fuck off."